Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining from. We're thrilled to welcome you to our Selling to Human Resources webinar today, featuring 3 brilliant panelists with complementary backgrounds to talk about the key challenges around selling into the HR function and the changing customer conversation to help HR deliver on organizational growth. Here at Insight Revenue, we conduct research to understand how high performers succeed in ways their peers can replicate. We do this because the sales environment is constantly changing. We then use that research to build training and tools to help commercial teams have better, more business-focused conversations with their buyers throughout the sales process. It's this research that will inform today's conversation. I'll let our panelists introduce themselves more fully, but today we're joined by Nicole Crowley, the VP of Human Resources at RedBud, Jan Kessler, VP of Sales at Preply, and Kelly Young, the Director of Customer Success at Thomas International. We're excited for them to share their perspectives, not only on our latest research, but what they are seeing in the market and how they're responding to the changes. Our discussion today is led by Timur Hicyilmaz, co-founder of Insight Revenue and lead researcher for the company and author of the white paper, Selling into HR. I'll let everyone introduce themselves and turn it over to Timur from there. Nicole, why don't you kick us off?
Hi, my name's Nicole Crowley. I founded a consulting firm a few years ago, providing the service of fractional heads of HR. So I currently serve as a fractional head of HR for a number of companies across various different industries.
And Kelly?
Hi, everyone. My name's Kelly. I am the Global Customer Success Director for Thomas International. So what we do at Thomas is we empower organizations to unlock the full potential of their people through deepening connection across individuals, teams, business goals, and cultural organizational alignment. So through the use of our science-backed psychometric assessments and people analytics, we can help leaders make smarter hiring decisions, build stronger teams, and drive more cohesive performance.
Hello, I'm Jan Kessler. I'm the VP of Sales at Preply. At Preply, what we do, we help companies to communicate better internally and externally. And how do we do this is by helping employees to strengthen their language skills with one-to-one tutoring.
Perfect. Well, thank you all. You can see the dynamic we've created here. It's two people who often sell through or to HR and one person who's often being sold to and has bought a lot. So I'm hoping this is going to make for a lively discussion. And to start us off, I wanted to talk a little bit about Marmite. So if you're from the UK, you'll be familiar with this. It's a breakfast spread. It's fermented yeast. It has a lot of vitamin B12. It's a very strong tasting thing. People have really strong opinions about Marmite. The closest thing I could think of in the US was maybe the Red Sox. You know, if you're from Boston, you love the Red Sox. The rest of the world is less keen on the Red Sox, shall we say. And the reason I bring it up is, you know, in our work, we talk to a lot of companies who sell into all kinds of different personas. And the observation about HR is people have really strong opinions about the HR buyer in a way they actually don't, say, when it comes to the CISO, for example, or you know, the head of compliance. That's much more sort of, okay, this person has these kinds of priorities. But with HR, you often hear a lot of strong opinions. So I wanted to start with you, start there, and tell me how you think this happens, and candidly, does it help or get in the way when you're trying to sell or buy? And again, no specific order. Do jump in, but otherwise, you know, Kelly, I could start it with you.
Yeah, sure. So I think it depends upon the seller's perception of HR, and I think it depends on the industry that you're selling into. So I think HR's had a seismic shift recently in terms of being much more strategic, much more involved in the architecture of workplace and organizational designs. But I think there is still a perception that they're there to manage grievances or to, you know, take the temperature of an organization from that perspective. And I think that a seller's perception of HR either helps or hinders that buying process. I think if you go in with a closed mind and a somewhat dated approach, you're likely to receive that back in the sense of a mirror reflects back what you show it. Whereas I think if you go in with a view that HR is strategic, it's organizationally aligned, it has a huge amount of influence, even if it doesn't hold the budget, you're much more likely to receive an open response than you are if you go in with a closed mindset. So to put myself in the Marmite camp, I'm a very big fan of HR. They're a huge part of the Thomas buying cycle and quite often our primary user and influencer and key stakeholder throughout the organization. So I hate Marmite, but I love HR.
I'm pretty aligned with Kelly overall, right? I think what people often forget is that HR is a function that runs across all the different business units within a business. So they need to have an understanding of each priority within the business. And a lot of salespeople, they usually just focus on directly trying to sell without necessarily trying to understand the complexity of the HR world and the fact that they need to involve multiple people before making a decision, right? So I don't like Marmite as well. I think I've tried once in my life and it was not necessarily the best favorite taste in the world, but I like HR overall because they're business critical and they usually have a very strong understanding of what is working well and what is not working well across the organization, not only one business unit.
I was going to say to a Frenchman, I think Marmite is actually barbaric. So I think
Yes.
that's entirely fair.
I have to agree, Marmite does not fall into my loved category, but you could probably tell that by my accent. I don't know many Americans scooping Marmite onto things. But I have to agree, if you actually looked at my role with, I'm working with, I think, 6 or so companies right at the moment, and my role varies very differently with each of those companies. Of course, core to it is me, so there is a certain level of influence and interest that I have with each of the companies. The role of HR is different, as it should be, based on the mission of the organization. I do think, starting with the assumption that there is larger influence and there is the ability to help navigate an organization is a good one, but you may find different answers as you start to investigate with the HR person that you're trying to sell through.
One other thing I wanted to touch on is, and Kelly, you and I chatted about this, is I sometimes think this can be something of a personality mismatch in terms of the buyers, and we chatted about that.
Yeah, we did definitely. So one of the key things that we do and support organizations with is looking at how people will align and connect or otherwise. And there's lots of research that in a 4-quadrant behavior, sellers will often sit on what's termed the more active side. So they're more outgoing, direct, results oriented. And traditionally, I'll sit on the more compliance, teamwork, organizational comfort level. So it's not good or bad, right or wrong. It's just different perspectives. And as you all know, when you meet people in any walk of life, the people who you connect with more easily are the people who share interests, values, ways of working, ways of talking. So quite often people who are in a selling role will have a goal and an agenda, and their key is to get to that goal or agenda, whereas HR will want to think about how does this impact, how does it influence, how do we do it properly, what's our return on investment. And it will be often a pace clash, is that the seller will want to get there quickly and HR will want to get there properly. Now, that's not always the case, and it depends on the seniority and the complexity of an individual and an organization, but generally we do see that there's quite an opposite dichotomy between a seller and a buyer. And getting into that buyer's framework, finding out what's important to them and what are their goals that they want to achieve and how quickly or in how much detail they want to achieve it could be a real win in selling into someone who's a little bit different from you from a behavioral perspective.
Just another perspective, Kelly. I think you can learn a lot in advance by looking at LinkedIn profiles of HR people. If you looked at mine, you'd see that I started my career in sales and actually fell into HR through management of salespeople and then eventually recruiting of salespeople. So typically when people call me to sell, I'm actually a cut to the chase. What is your product? What do you need? How much does it cost? Let's go through this. Do you have a sandbox I can play in? And I am very interested. I actually tend to coach salespeople along the way because they'll start to ask me discovery questions that aren't pertinent. And I'm like, what you really want to ask me is this. And you'll see a lot of people, there are a number of people who fall into HR from the recruiting space, and recruiting is selling, right? And so you can sort of tell by the background of the HR person where they might lean. If they're more into the compliance, project management, doing this right, or if they're more into how do we push this decision through and how do we do what's right for the organization?
Yeah, and I think that's a super great point, Nicole. And it all comes back to where we kind of kick this off, which is, do your research, don't make assumptions, and don't dump everybody into a category. Find out as much as you can about those individuals. But yeah, I totally agree with you.
Maybe I will give you a ring after this call, in this case, Nicole, right?
Right, that is the hope for the sessions.
Okay, that's the objective.
So beyond obviously the strong opinions people have, and you've all touched on this, there's an awful lot going on, I think, in the world of HR. Some of it's external, some of it is internal. And what we find is, and Nicole, it's building a little bit on what you're saying, what we find is key, especially to selling larger deals often, is like you need to be able to make a connection. You need to be able to understand, like, how do you fit into people's world? And while the external environment is somewhat out of people's control, it is a little bit of what sort of governs people's focus. So, you all work intimately with different people. So it's very curious to get your take on, like, what do you see as being new and different, actually, as opposed to what's always been hard? And we have some ideas here. Like, one of the things, digital workforce transformation, AI, is obviously a big thing. An emerging trend we're hearing is sort of a transition maybe from sort of a role-based approach to workforce planning to maybe a skills-based workforce planning. Because I think what people are thinking is that they think the nature of the work is going to change, and that therefore they need to go back to first principles a little bit, because they think they can no longer guarantee that you're going to be in this precise role for as long as it was. Change fatigue comes up a lot. But let me stop there. Would love to get a sense for what you're all hearing.
Yeah, I mean, happy to start, right? I mean, we mostly deal with mid-market and enterprise clients, and a couple of things. I think overall, we discuss mostly with HR, L&D managers, and so on, and the top priority still seems to be how we can actually improve the skills of our workforce. How can we build programs that are dedicated to our top performers to help them to improve and to strengthen their skills, right? This is definitely one of the biggest topic. The second one, it's probably related to engagement, which here I think is managing change fatigue as well, right? But engagement as well with the new generation that is coming up on the market. It's a completely different types of generation that is less engaged with companies, the value, and so on. And I think a lot of HR are trying to understand how to keep them engaged, motivated, and just to stay within the company, right? Not to change role, just disappear from one day to the other. I don't know if this is what you see, Nicole, as well on your side, right? But that's definitely a point that we see and that I hear a lot from different HRs.
I think there's a huge focus on figuring out how to create very agile organizations that can respond to the economy, to the environment, to AI coming on board. It is tricky. We set budgets based on certain revenue projections. We either hit those revenue projections, or in this case, probably not hit those revenue projections this year. And that impacts what your budget is for next year. You're dealing with the fear we have to get people to adopt AI, but simultaneously they see AI replacing them. We have to think about how we are giving the workforce the skills so that they grow with the organization in a world of artificial intelligence. And so all of these things, and you think about, well, what are the skills we should train those people on so that they can stay with the organization and create more certainty for them. And so there's just a lot of fear and change, and creating an organization that is elastic, so to say, and can respond well to those various changes. I think is the major challenge that I see in front of me with most of the organizations I'm working with.
Kelly, you're right in the world of skills development, so I was curious to see how that resonates with you.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. And I think that what we're seeing across a lot of our customers now is exactly as Nicole has just said. How do you hire for the now and plan for the future and keep people engaged, motivated, on board? And it's largely around assessing whether someone's got the potential, because organizations are moving quickly, roles are changing. And I think it isn't just digital transformation. I think the the word you used, Nicole, was beautiful, elastic, right? I think there's a level of elasticity required across all organizations now. And how do you get the very best people in? How do you keep them motivated? Because there's always that dichotomy of if I hire someone with a ton of potential who's future bright on the hope and the promise that we're going to change and be agile, how do I keep them motivated and engaged at times where we're not? Because businesses are not always pinging back and forth and being agile. There's going to be times of consistency and potential stagnation as you move through the change curve. So how do you find those people? How do you hire those people? And really importantly, to Jan's point, how do you keep them engaged once you've got them? Because the new generation that's coming through is they don't align in the same way as previous generations with their purpose. Their sense of purpose appears to be a lot deeper, and they want to connect at a much, I don't know, much more values level than perhaps previous generations have. And so how do you keep them intellectually stimulated, emotionally stimulated, psychologically stimulated, provide them with a career path that isn't clear? So again, we can look at people's aptitude, personality, behaviors, connectivity, etc. But I think it's really about being clear and transparent about what the opportunities are and how can an individual fit into those opportunities. And I think this generation is particularly good at having grown-up conversations about what they won't want. I don't think they suffer in silence particularly. I think they're very good at stating their case and stating their discomfort, which is both a positive and a negative, right? It's great to know where you stand, but it's also sometimes difficult to hear. So I think creating that environment of transparency, honesty, and open communication is really critical. And I think that must be a very challenging thing for HR to do as well, because there's always a balance between what you can or can't share, what you do or don't know about the future of an organization, and keeping people in the loop appropriately is, I imagine, quite a difficult balance to strike.
Okay, and maybe I have a question actually for you ladies, right? Because we discussed about digital transformation, AI, and I'm quite keen to understand your perspective, maybe starting with Kelly as well, right? Because from my perspective, it seems that, I mean, AI, everybody's talking about AI today, but it doesn't seem that especially the HR function has a very clear understanding on how they can implement AI within their function. And we're all floated by AI tools that are promising us next return, working 2 days per week instead of 5 days per week, reduce the cost and so on. But I feel that I used to sell to CFOs. Now I'm selling to HR, and I feel like HR a little bit more risk averse when he's actually trying AI features or AI tools. I don't know, what is your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a personal level, my son, who's 11, called me a dinosaur a few weeks ago because I dared to use Google instead of Copilot to search for something. So that's how quickly we're moving. I'm now a dinosaur for a tool that didn't even exist when I was his age. But I think from a professional level, we at Thomas are really embracing AI because, again, the speed at which people want to absorb information is so much greater than it's ever been. So nobody wants to read long form reports anymore. People want to input their question and get that response, get the pertinent points, and get it tailored to the question that they're asking. So we actually have AI from a coaching perspective built into our platform. So you can ask it a question about an individual and it will pull out their results and tailor it to the nature of the question or what you're trying to achieve. But you're right, it does appear that certain industries or certain HR professionals are a little nervous about AI. And I really, really understand that, because I think that unless you can really validate that you've got an ethical AI system, how do you know where it's pulling from? How do you know what it's saying? And if you're using that in any way related to people, whether it's hiring, firing, development, whatever it might be, I think there is a natural level of caution in HR around AI. So I think if we're incorporating AI in our platforms, we have a moral and ethical responsibility to prove to our HR buyers that it is a closed system, that it isn't just pulling random information from any corner of the dark web, etc. So I agree, and I'm seeing a hesitance, which we are able to overcome, but it takes a little bit more effort to do so, and it takes a little bit of proving to our HR buyers that our system is closed and ethical. But Nicole, being in the front seat of HR, I wonder how you feel about AI.
I feel as if I were to look across my clients, their comfort level and ability or desire to be transparent probably directly aligns with their comfort with AI. So companies that I work with that hold data very closely, that and for good reason. Okay, I'm not necessarily saying that they're not transparent, but they are focused on confidentiality and being conservative in terms of the information that they release. And there's more control over AI at those companies. For example, a group call started and somebody had on a note taker and they couldn't figure out how to turn the note taker off, and the call was shut down. And not to say that anything truly confidential was going to be shared on that call, but there was just fear. And then I have companies that are, running towards AI. I think those who fall into that strategic role in HR are curious and figuring it out. To Kelly's point, we are trained to be lock boxes, that people say things to us and it doesn't get repeated. And AI is almost the antithesis to that. And so the tools, there is, however, a huge amount of efficiency. Some examples of just how I use it easily are for summarizing exit interviews, summarizing recruiting feedback. A lot of it is in a summarization capacity, but to be able to take all of my notes and feed them into a system and say, summarize all of this without my having to read through it and pick out what's relevant. And that's where AI is better than I am. However, I use a system that does not use anything external, that only uses the data that I feed to it. So the artificial intelligence is really just taking my intelligence and summarizing it. And I feel safe doing that. But I am less of a, ChatGPT user or some of the larger platforms, out of fear that it is not keeping my data entirely private.
Yeah, and I've certainly experienced that as well. When joining customer calls, if there's an AI note taker, people ask for it to be removed, because often in our line of work in customer success as well, we'll be talking about individuals and performance and quite deeply personal things and how we might support our customers. So the note taker, which almost feels ubiquitous now, doesn't it, on every call, is still generating nerves.
I think my takeaway is a bit like the previous conversation. If you come across somebody who is cautious, it is probably appropriate. And in particular, HR departments, to risk a joke, you have an HR department because you want things to work and not break. Like, you should lean into that. That might be the trick, rather than being frustrated by it. To change tacks a little bit, I wanted to show you some data. This is data from buyers and sellers. Some of them would have been in the HR tech audience, but this is a cross-industry sample. And it's an observation around the state of trust when it comes to buying and selling. And roughly, the observation we make is both buyers and sellers, but sellers more so, do actually trust claims around functionality, performance, service levels, all the statements that a product or solution might provide. But where trust levels fall off, including for sales, is that people don't necessarily believe that you're going to deliver an ROI or the business case for them. And I wanted to have a discussion around how you see this happening and what you might have done to work against, to counteract this, rather. Jan, in your world, for example, I imagine language learning is not an easy thing to measure. How have you seen this in operation?
Yeah, exactly. I think overall people are a little bit more reluctant to sign long-term contract without trying the product themselves, right? Especially what we provide, right, which is language learning, is not something where you can actually see an impact from day one and from lesson one, right, between a tutor and an employee or a student. So I think it's challenging. This is one. Number two, in the last couple of years, I think buyers have received the same types of content, the same types of metrics, the same types of information that is being sold by salespeople, right? Without necessarily a clear return of investment. Today, people are a little bit more, in companies, are a little bit more cost cautious. We need to be careful. We need to explain every single expense that we do, and return of investment is definitely one of the main topics. The way we overcome that objection, we mostly do a lot more trial, a lot more pilots, so people can actually try the platform for 2 months up to sometimes 3 months for a very small amount of cost, but it's definitely more strategy of landing and expanding. So we usually onboard about 20, 50 learners, and then once actually our buyers see the value in the platform, then we have a huge upside for the next year. But it takes a lot more relationship, trust, and delivering results until you can actually have the same sales value of the contract that we used to have, for example, a couple of years ago.
And I think, that's very similar to what we see as well. There's a lot of years of experience, particularly in HR buyers, of being kind of oversold or overpromised and underdelivered. And I think as well, there's a lot of people. Oh, I can definitely read, ROI of X, Y, Z, A, B, C. But I think the key question that we should all be asking is, what is it that you want to achieve? What would return on investment look like for you? What are the key goals? And also not promising you can do it all in the first 30, 60, 90 days, or even in the first year, and putting those into a tangible business case that supports the HR individual to challenge key stakeholders in the business about what they really want, I think is really helpful. And how it measures tangible results, because everyone will say, oh, we can reduce your attrition by X, Y, and Z, but that might not be my goal. So what is my goal? How do we measure it? And then being honest and impactful about how you've done against it and setting realistic frameworks, I think is the key for me. So translating into business impact is what has helped, I think, in our instance.
I do think that, as it relates to human resources, there's probably nothing more important than trustworthiness. Human resources, it's almost as if, in many organizations, sales organizations, where you're selling into a finite pool and you're selling multiple products into a finite pool, there's this idea of you need to preserve the relationship at all costs. It's not just about the initial sale. And I think the same holds true with human resources. We are people who seek to understand, period. That is just how we're wired. We want to understand why people work the way they do, why organizations function in the way that they do. And we want to understand the product and how it's going to help. And because your product doesn't have a feature or doesn't lead with a certain feature that might be important, that can be okay, but I want to hear transparency about it from the salesperson. I want to hear, what are your renewal rates and why do people leave your platform? And that doesn't mean I'm not going to buy it from you. It just makes me understand the challenges I'm going to have in implementing, or if I'm going to need another service to complement yours to solve my problem. So I want the salesperson to almost be a problem solver with me versus a product pusher. And their product can likely be a part of the solution if I understand the entirety of how it's going to solve my problem. And so that's where trustworthiness, and again, in a world where I'm likely to move on to another organization, just as we all are, people seem to have 2 to 3 year life cycles at this point. I'm your next salesperson, right? You're going to sell to me again at another company. And I am known, I have somebody at a certain product that I really like who now has it set up. I can call him directly when I'm introducing him to a new client, and I don't take any sort of kickbacks, so to say. But I have one person, I know how to implement, it goes quickly, and I know what problem it's going to solve for that client. So that's why I think trustworthiness is even more important, because, HR is lied to a lot. So I think we see through that and want to just understand the entirety of your product.
That's great advice. So one thing we see is there is probably no subject, I think, that people make a heavier meal out of than how to deliver value. And what I find a little bit is that it might be as simple as asking, look, what are you trying to do with this thing? Are you trying to make some money? Is it somehow going to help you sell more? And there are different ways of doing that. Are you trying to save costs in one way or another? Or are there risks that you're worried about? And then I think it's about the appropriate solution rather than what we see, at least, is a lot of people leading with, we delivered a 3.x ROI. And I think that then begs the question, how exactly did you do this? Is because I'm not them, I'm something else. So discovery. So I was going to ask you a questions on discovery, like in your experience, what's your perceptions of discovery? How sellers do discovery, and then Nicole, in your sense, like how well or not is it done?
I mean, how well it is done. I think overall, amongst the sales industry, I don't think it's really well done. Otherwise, sales will sell a little bit more to HR. There's a bit of friction between what the sales want and what the HR persons want. In my humble perspective, I think it's because a lot of sales are not curious enough to genuinely be interested in company priorities, what are they trying to solve, and providing a potential solution for your buyer, even if this means not necessarily selling your solution. To give you a very concrete example, I was about 2 to 3 weeks ago with a very large global 500 company on the phone to discuss about language learning for one of their office. And the lady was telling me that for this year is not the priority. She really need to launch a new skills program for a certain types of top exec, and she was looking for a firm. And through my contact, I was working with a firm back in the days, and I refer her that contact. She then ghosted me for a couple of weeks now, but she came back last week saying, look, we should have a chat end of the year once the budget a little bit more finalized. So yes, I helped her out for something that was business critical for her at the moment that we spoke, which is not related to me. I'm not going to win anything from it, but I built value, and more importantly, I think I built somehow some trust and relationship with that buyer. And I know that once and if we open the discussion again towards the end of the year, I will have a strong competitive advantage versus my competitors because I will have that trust and I would add value to her already.
I couldn't agree more. I think the key is in appropriate and bespoke discovery as opposed to formulaic kind of push through the funnel, ask this question, get this objection, move across your flow chart. And I think actually just showing up with authenticity, empathy, curiosity will, in my experience, get you a really long way to discovering what is the key issue that people are trying to solve, what is their core problem, and how your solution may or may not solve it. And again, being honest about it and saying, listen, our solution doesn't solve your problem. We'd love it if it did, but it doesn't. And I think for me, that bridges that trustworthiness gap in discovery as well and helps you get to the core. So Jan, your example of building trust with that buyer will all have come, I'm sure, from your kind of authenticity, empathy, and deep listening as opposed to making assumptions and trying to push your own agenda.
I do think with discovery, and Timur, you and I spent a little bit of time talking about this. There is a lot of lazy discovery out there where somebody has a set group of questions that I think they are making assumptions as they ask you each question. My favorite being, who needs to be a part of making decisions in your organization? You know, I know you're clearly trying to get a list of other people you should contact to also get this product in front of. Do you have budget authority? You know, it's all of those things versus those questions are you're almost asking me like, am I important enough to drive this decision? And do I have I think I use the phrase dad Timur with you in the organization who ultimately needs to sign off. And the reality is there are many women in human resources. There are a number of us who report to men. There can be some of that assumption there as well. And I love the questions that are open-ended, that are, tell me about the last purchasing decision that you were involved in. How did that happen? Like, why did it happen? I spoke with somebody who was selling an HRIS to me, and I said, do you have an applicant tracking system? And he said, yes, but it's terrible. Like, don't use it. And he's correct. I knew that, actually. I wanted to see how transparent he was with me about that versus getting me to think that he had an all-in-one solution. So I think those questions that are assuming that that person has the ability to say yes today and then letting them tell you that they don't is the smart way to discover, if it makes sense, versus the opposite. Because the opposite can feel formulaic and, quite frankly, at times insulting. So I really like smart questions where I feel like the person is engaging and, again, truly seeking to understand me and my organization versus their sales objectives. And Jan, I totally hear you on hiring, especially younger salespeople who are calling and they have a goal to reach, etc. But their key to success is going to be learning to act as if. And I'm fine if you're acting as if and you're not really interested in my organization. That's okay. You're trying. A for effort, you know? So I think that's really important to instill in more junior salespeople the ability to do that.
My cue was one reason why we think the trust gap happens, and I think, Nicole, this builds on your conversation, is that, at any company of reasonable size, like literally nobody makes buying decisions on their own. Like this would be true for absolutely everything that I can think of. Even a CEO typically has to go to a board if it's large enough. And yet, the thing we observe is that salespeople consistently underestimate the number of people who are involved in a purchase. In this case, the seller said they typically think there are 3 active principals. The buyer said it was more like 7. Other people would actually put that number far higher. Gartner, I think, typically goes with like 11 and 12. But I think that the important part is there's the gap. And so I'm going to build on your comment, Nicole. So how would you recommend people navigate this without literally asking, so who else's approval do we need?
I do think asking the question about, tell me about historical purchases and how that has happened. Tell me how I can support you. So I love when a salesperson asks me that, because typically, if somebody is trying to sell into an organization where I sit as head of HR, there is a portion of it in which I need the salesperson. And then there's a portion of it where I'm actually not going to put the salesperson in front of our CEO. I'm going to take that on. Because those internal conversations are going to happen fast with my lens on than necessarily inviting a salesperson into it. And so I love when organizations have one-pagers, summaries, things built out to support me in sharing the value proposition of whatever it is I'm selling internally. So I think, again, and I'm one person, you're going to talk to many different pieces in human resources, but they know the map. Human resources, for the most part, even if they're on the compliance side and more regulatory and, they serve as the police, men, women, people for the organization, they tend to understand when budgeting happens. They tend to have access to budgets. They tend to see the types of things that are bought and the price points, etc. And so just recognize that regardless of whether or not they're the ones creating new roads on the map or whether or not they're just reading the map, they probably have information for you. So ask the smart question and interpret their answers to see how they can be most helpful to you in getting to that sale. Again, if the sale is right for the organization.
Yeah, and Kelly, what are your thoughts? What are you
I couldn't
taking away from this, really?
I couldn't agree more. I think that HR are, because they work across every function and they're unique often in that regard, they are often the most knowledgeable, most well connected, most influential people in a business. Actually, there's very few HR departments that work in silos, and if they do, they're probably not doing a particularly great job. And I think that helping a stakeholder, whether it's at the buying point or whether it's at implementation point, deliver your product. Because again, you're trying to sell into somebody. Why should the lift be on your buyer? Why should the lift be on the person who's bought your solution? The lift should be on you as a seller or an implementer to make that process and that journey as easy, as slick, as straightforward as possible. So things like one pages around value proposition or ROI or use case, any of those things, to me, should be an absolute no-brainer. And I think I agree with you, Nicole. It's not always appropriate to put a seller in to pitch to the CEO, but can they help you prep your deck? Can they help you with objections? Can they play good cop to your bad cop, knowing your CEO and vice versa? And just really help people understand at a deep level what it is and what it's going to do for your organization and how they can feel empowered to understand that and take it through the organization. So again, I think the key is absolutely support people, but ask those honest, open-ended questions of what does it look like for you in your organization and how can I help you to be successful will get you a lot further than can I talk to your boss.
Yeah, because I think my line a little bit is HR gets over and underestimated. It is overestimated in terms of willingness to literally champion you, and that's partly because I think it's what you said. You're used to having difficult conversations. Of course, it's always going to be a positive, reasonable experience. On the other hand, underestimated in sense that one, you probably selected the buyers in the first place, and wanting to do right by all the stakeholders doesn't mean that it isn't your decision, perhaps. That's I think is then different actually than other audiences.
Maybe another way to understand this slide, right, is from a seller perspective, what you want to go is directly to the decision maker, right? From a buyer perspective, you have to make sure that you actually listen to everybody's perspective, right? So the way I actually see this slide is mostly probably poor discovery from most of the sellers that do not try to understand who is going to be impacted by the decision, positively, negatively, who is today feeling the pain. By asking those two single questions, you could actually understand what are the business unit or the people that actually feel or will be involved in the decision making, right? So you don't necessarily need to even understand the name, but if you understand the function, what are the problems that they're trying to solve, you can actually help them to build that one pager that Nicole and Kelly mentioned, right? That will help not only to discuss with the CEO, but as well with all the influencers. And if you have 5 people talking to the CEO and saying, yes, we should buy this tool, it's always much easier decision for him, just that you have one person challenging him. So that's the way I would see it.
Brilliant. Which I think goes nicely to our next question around sales skills. This is data from buyers. We ask them to assess the salespeople they interact with in terms of, what's a strength, what's a weakness, items of the length of things that they think of as being strong, the ones to the right are the things where they rarely see people being very, very, very strong. The strengths, the first one, maybe, and honestly, part of me thinks that should be much higher, is managing the relationship. So that's being responsive, reliable, conscientious, all of those good things. Buyers would say, on average, people are pretty good at that. One observation that no salesperson has ever agreed with, but most buyers actually think salespeople are decent at negotiation, which, again, I think both parties underestimate the degree to which the other might need both parties might need each other. But the interesting ones are really around there. Business case we touched on a little bit, supplying the right expert advice, identifying additional ways of delivering value, that all ties into discovery. And then, struggling to deliver insights. That's perennial, honestly. That has always been hard. So again, would love to get your reactions and thoughts around this, and to hear maybe a little bit about how you've helped people remediate against this.
So I think in my experience, and this, I've bought software as well myself in my role, people are often stuck in product or feature mode. This is what it will do for you. This is what it does. Oh, look, it comes in green. Oh, look, we can change the branding. We can label it up. And again, I think all people want to buy rather than to be sold to. And the questions then are, what is the insight that you're going to give me? It's great that it comes in all of these colors, and it's wonderful that it does all of these things, but how do you answer that so what question? And I think the so what question for me all comes back to the word that's been used a few times and not being formulaic, finding out what is the real problem and digging really deeply to understand what is it that your buyer is trying to solve, how are they trying to solve it, what will good look like when you have solved it, and how long do you think is realistic or reasonable to get there? Because if your product will solve their problem but it'll take 10 years and they've got a 2-year horizon, then there's alignment but not quickly enough. So again, I think it's having that robust, open, transparent discovery conversations and then trying to align outcomes to that and just elevating up past features. And eventually you do have to do features. Everybody wants to know what it technically does and how it technically works and is it easy to use. But I think sometimes people start with that. They start with a feature and a tech demo, whereas they should be starting with understanding challenges. How do I help you overcome those challenges? And then getting into the nuts and bolts of, okay, well, if I understand you correctly, this is what we need to achieve. This is how long it's going to take. This is what you want. And then here's the gap between what I've got and what you want. And can we overcome that? And I think it, again, all just comes back to having open, empathic, transparent conversations and really importantly, not over-promising and under-delivering, because that is a recipe for disaster. And from a CS perspective, it's a recipe for churn at the end of a contract a few years down the line, which is my most hated thing. So doing a good job up front benefits everybody from a seller and a buyer perspective.
I agree, Kelly. I think this goes back to my love of discovery, but I think in the discovery phase, the idea of going slowly to then move quickly is very important, and why I'm a huge fan within sales organizations of having ramp periods for new salespeople that are reasonable, because so often we get a new body in seat and we have expectations of them to start producing to impact the bottom line, and it encourages behavior that actually doesn't support the long-term sales process. It encourages people to be less transparent, to be more pushy, to be more aggressive in the sales process. And when people truly slow down, good salespeople during the sales process, and understand exactly what problems we're trying to solve and how things happen within the business, and then to Kelly's point, map those challenges to the product and are transparent around, here is where my product is going to fall short, and here are some other ways in which here's some workarounds. I love a workaround. Almost all products need a workaround. Tell me about that. Tell me about other customers who use your product who have the same issue and what they do. Connect me with them. Offer them as a reference. That step forward in transparency, I think, would lead to higher scores in terms of the strength category on skills.
I tend to agree. My key takeaway here, or the most important metric that I look at here, is delivering unique insight or value, which is really low, is at 8%, which tells us that the buyer don't really feel like the seller is an expert in what they do to deliver that trust, that expertise to the buyer to make them very comfortable to buy. This is the way how I read it. One reason could be from the one that Nicole explained. We hire a lot of new sales reps. They don't have enough time to ramp, sometimes no expertise in the industry, and they just completely repeat that script companies are actually telling them to follow. But it goes back to expertise. If and when, for me, a buyer is actually coming to a call to buy a tool, they're actually looking for expertise. Most of the time, they don't buy those type of tools every year or every 2 years. Sometimes it's every 5 years. You mentioned about Hicyilmaz before, Nicole, right? So they come for expertise. They're not necessarily expert. Taking the example of Preply, most of the buyers that we talk to, they're not expert in language learning. They do not know and do not understand how long it will take a student or an employee to go from B1 to B2 and so on, right? So they come from expertise. And I think that's one of the reasons why, as well, our company is doing well, is because we are training our sellers to be expert, but more importantly, to actually explain to the buyer what are the options available in markets, what could be a good option for them if they're looking for X, and what could be a good option for them if they're looking for B. This helps us not only to disqualify things on the first place, but more importantly to build that relationship and the trust, because we actually add expertise, because nobody explained them what are the options in the market. This is specifically for us, but even as a Hicyilmaz, right, to take again the example from Nicole, I think if you have a buyer that clearly explains you based on what you're actually looking for, based on the objective that you're trying to fulfill, those are the category of Hicyilmaz that you look for. Sometimes, obviously, you might lose a sale, so you still want to push and to try to sell, but at the end of the day, I mean, Kelly, who is on the CS side, knows that a bad sale is never really good for the company, because it's a churn clients after all, so you're not going to pay off.
With that, I wanted to see if there were any questions, really, Becky, if we gotten anything.
Yeah, one. So we've talked a lot about just curiosity and really understanding. And one question I have is, how do you train curiosity, and how do you hire for curiosity? And I guess philosophically, can you train curiosity?
Well, I can answer the question on how you can hire for curiosity. I'm not sure I can answer the question on how you can train for curiosity. So curiosity is a facet of personality. So there are tests on the market that, including one at Thomas, that test for curiosity, and it looks at it on a scale. And again, as in all walks of life, someone with a lower curiosity score doesn't necessarily mean that they are completely uncurious, don't ever ask any questions, but it's the nature of how an individual goes about it and how innate it is to them to probe a little deeper and ask it. I think, as with anything, you can train things. But I think there's got to be a desire from the individual to want to be more curious. And of course, as with anything in life as well, you can put coping strategies in place, scripts, prompts, and experience helps with curiosity. But you can definitely hire around curiosity. But I don't know, Nicole, you might have greater experience across your HR career of whether you've ever been able to train for curiosity.
I agree. There are curious people and there are not curious people. However, I do think that there is a lot of modeling of curiosity that can take place. I find more tenured reps and more tenured recruiters, who I think are similar, start to become more curious over time. And curiosity develops, quite frankly. I recall when I was an early stage recruiter and I'd have to do, 10 interviews in a day, and I had my questions and I would just pick up the phone and ask those questions. It was not sustainable for me until I became curious. Until I said, I'm not actually hiring into this position, but I'm figuring out, if I were to hire you, what position would I hire you into? So going into that assumption led me to be more curious. And I think tasking sales reps with that larger goal, so it's not so much to fill out their list of questions, but to say, if I were going to sell to you, what sort of thing would I sell to you and how would I sell that to you, is going to lead to more information and more of a curious nature. I also think that, I don't actually expect sales reps to be experts in their space. And in fact, I, love when they tell me what they do know and what they don't know, and they invite subject matter expertise to speak with me in some capacity. And I think those people who are subject matter experts and product side support, tend to be very curious. And I think giving salespeople the idea of listen to them, see how they're curious, see how much more information they get when they ask smart questions out of curiosity that could lead to a sale, maybe not tomorrow, maybe in 6 months, but again, preservation of the relationship. So that's my 2 cents. I think modeling curiosity for salespeople and having them take on that, listening for it and showing how that works well for their end goal, I think is helpful.
Yeah, maybe just to add on to answer maybe Kelly's question on how to train. I'm not sure you can really train somebody to become very curious, but you can train them at least to help them to understand what are we trying to achieve as an organization, what's the value of the product or the service that you're actually selling on the organization, but as well on people's life. And then, in my opinion, then people start to connect the dots a little bit and actually see, oh, okay, now I understand why I'm asking those questions and what alternative question actually I could ask, either to qualify a client or disqualify a client as a good or a bad fit right away, right? So that transparency, I feel, is not often really well shared in sales organization with the reps. We just tell them you need to do X, but we don't actually tell them why and how impactful their inputs are going to be for the business.
No, I think that's a great remark. We see that a lot in our training efforts, where discovery, on one hand, it is a checklist, but we want to give people a sense of, look, it's not literally yes, no, it's here is a body of knowledge you need to have to verify whether or not this is viable or not. And I think, and Nicole, I loved your words around, like, imagine the other person, like what are they? Like, for them to say yes, what are all the pieces they have to deliver? Yes, so I think my sense is with sales, and with anybody, honestly, you can probably be a little more instrumental because both parties have deadlines. There are goals. It is not a literal exploration. So wanted to thank you all very much. This was a great discussion. To finish a little bit on the reason we do these, the reason we brought you together. Insight Revenue's mission is to build high performing teams that can deliver value across the customer journey. What we find is people know what they should do a lot of the time. They might not have the knowledge, the skills, the practice, the courage to do it. And so that's what we try and do. And research like this is a large part of it because you need to know your counterpart. You need to understand how the thing you have fits into their world, them personally, but also the larger buying group. And that's where we come in. So with that, again, huge thank you, and looking forward to the discussion. And for anybody who wants more information, the white paper has more on the topic.